Hello, I am Paige Farrington.
And I am Ashlyn Prendergast, and we are the co-founders of Love Ignites Peace. And this is our podcast, the Love Ignites Peace Bathtub Chat Book Club podcast, where every month we read a book that empowers your relationships, especially the one with yourself.
Read the book and then listen to the podcast, or just listen to the podcast and decide if you want to read the book, or just enjoy the discussion and take away a few words of wisdom. For those that have been listening for a while, welcome back. And for those first-time listeners, we are so glad to have you join us. Today, we have with us Teresa Hernandez, a longtime spiritual coach and entrepreneur and merchandising marvel. We also have Jenna Principe, a seeker of wisdom, a marketing guru, a San Diego native, and a lover of her people and life. Ashlyn Prendergast. Give us a wave there, Ashlyn. Ashlyn Prendergast. She is a very wise woman, still in her 20s, and my daughter. She has the heart of a lion and the mind of a business visionary. Ashlyn is the voice that keeps me in my lane and Love Ignites Peace's public presence moving forward. And finally, me, Paige Farrington, an author, entrepreneur, public speaker, and a never-ending student of life, love, and the human experience. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about each one of us, go to loveignitespeace.com/book-club. This month, our book is The Silent Female Scream by Rosjke Hasseldine. Ashlyn, take us away and give us a summary of the book.
Awesome. What is the silent female scream? We hear a silent female scream anywhere females have been silenced themselves out of fear. Fear of not being heard, of being criticized or ridiculed, fear of invoking anger or disagreement. The silent female scream is present anytime a female is trying to speak her truth but isn't heard, and then learns to believe that her words do not matter. This book explores the legacy of emotional silence that many women have inherited from long before their grandmother's day. The author warns that emotional silence damages the mother-daughter relationship, women's relationships with themselves and each other, and their equality and visibility. Which obviously we're so excited to chat with everyone here today about this topic, especially as a group of women here chatting and sharing our life experiences. So let's start with the first question, which is, as a woman, did you think this is an important book for you to read? Why or why not?
Jump right in, ladies.
Well, okay, I'll go. Well, I thought the book looked scary to me. I'm just going to say. So right away, it didn't resonate in my body just looking at it. So that might have mentally set me up with a little block, but I jumped in and went for it. I'll be honest, there were some parts I didn't really agree with, I didn't really relate to. And then there was some little moments that I got a little information out of it. So that's just my beginning.
I would love to know at some point, maybe not in this moment, maybe we can come back to it, but I would love to know at some point what you didn't agree with and what didn't resonate with you.
Okay.
So my opinion on the book, I was really expecting to love this one. I loved the way that it started out. Something that stood out to me in the beginning was when they called out the differences between the way men and women are described reproductively in biology books. And that grasped my attention right away. But as I continued to read, I didn't love the tone of the book. And I felt like it was overwhelmingly just angry and kind of negative and a little bit victim mentality, which, for the record, is justified in a lot of ways and a little bit ironic given the way what the book talks about. I think a lot of the things she talked about were really, really important, but I thought it just felt really daunting to read of like, okay, so what's the solution? Like, yes, and. And I think I'll get into more of this in a bit, but I also think I am not blind to the differences between men and women and the ways that we are treated unfairly, but I think that we can't dwell on that day in and day out. I think I also was raised in a family that was very like female empowerment centric. Like I never felt like I couldn't do certain things because I was a female. And I'm also in a relationship that is very empowering to me, and the ways in which I'm naturally feminine or female, they don't detract from me, I guess. So, all in all, I personally think that there are actually a lot better, more impactful books on female empowerment. So, this was not my favorite, and I don't know that I would recommend it.
Well, thank you for I thought I was going to be the only one tonight that felt exactly verbatim, word for word that you said is exactly how I felt almost from the very beginning to the last page. It had for me and my ears and how I absorbed it, it had a deeply angry overtone that I felt like she was never really looking for an answer. It was more just a way to vent. Were there some explanations and some stories? And sure, it just felt like she was screaming internally for herself. That's how I took it. That's how it resonated with me. So
I think that's really interesting, Teresa, the way you just said that. And I think there definitely was some of that. This was her story.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is such an interesting and a little bit difficult book for me to comment on for a couple reasons. One, I read her other book, The Mother-Daughter Puzzle, first. And thus, it's hard for me to go into this book as a neutral person because I already learned a lot of these things, already heard a lot of her story through the other book. And I will say what's interesting is when I started that other book, I grappled for a little bit of like, well, this is really like against like the patriarchy and sexism. And like, it rubbed me almost in a way where I'm like, whoa, are we doing too much blaming? Kind of like, what was the book that we read? Remember, we really didn't like the lady's perspective. Do you guys remember what that book was?
Yes, but I can't pull the name out of the hat right here at the moment. Yes.
Okay. It kind of had that initial tone. But the other reason this is nuanced in giving my opinion is because we are actually doing our coaching certification with this woman right now. And when you meet her, she is so lovely. You guys would love her. She is thoughtful. She is kind. She is like about understanding. Like her tone is nothing like this book comes off as. So I can't quite get my mind straight actually exactly about this book because I have too many other factors coming into it. But I did feel in reading it, it was one of those things where, Teresa, I think you said it, right? There are some good takeaways, some things I was like, that's a really good thing to think about. And then there are also things that I have no interest in, not particular to my life, doesn't pertain. And then some things I'm not quite sure about. So, it was a similar journey nonetheless. But yeah, mixed feelings. And in hindsight, I wish we would have picked The Mother-Daughter Puzzle to read, her other book, because that I think every single woman should read.
Yeah, I held judgment till I was done because I kept thinking, well, it's going to go somewhere. I never felt it went anywhere. And honestly, I can't think of one person I would recommend this book to personally.
I have recommended this book to a couple of women. And I recommend it to women who I feel have been very silenced. And I think that we're a little bit of a unique group here. None of us really in this group, to my knowledge, have suffered abuse, have been in, really abusive relationships, or if we've had an abusive parent. And as a result, we haven't felt as silenced, maybe, as some other women do. I mean, there truly are women who are very silenced because of a million reasons. One of them is the patriarchal culture that we live in. Like the woman's voice doesn't really even matter that much in a lot of instances. We were actually reading an article for this class that we're doing, and it talked about how a woman wrote this book about motherhood, and then a man wrote a book about motherhood. But the woman's book about motherhood wasn't even referenced. It was the man's book that was referenced. And it's just these I think there's things that are so subtle that we just have to kind of keep an eye out for that. And the other thing there was something else that really hit me about this book is, and Ashlyn and I've had lots of discussions about this, and this has really helped our relationship, but I am a woman who really didn't have any emotional needs, and that may be surprising. And honestly, reading, and I don't know if it was this book, honestly, or the mother-daughter puzzle, but at some point I had this moment of, oh my gosh, I have no emotional needs because my life has been one of such like self-sacrifice. And it was to the point I didn't even know what I desired. I didn't even know what I needed because I was always sacrificing. In fact, I'll tell you a really quick story. When my husband and I, when we graduated from college, he had a degree in aerospace engineering and I had a business degree. And he had a dream to be a musician. So what did I do? I said, you don't need to go get a job. I'll go get the job. You go out and pursue your dreams. And it never even occurred to me to say, well, these are my dreams. And on the flip side, it never occurred to him to ask me, oh, well, what are your dreams?
Yeah, one of my favorite takeaways from, again, I know we're going to meld both books together because our brains have been so entrenched, but is what you just said. And I know this was mentioned in the Silent Female Scream. It's the idea of having a woman's needs inquired after. And so I think that there are some really good nuggets that we can take away from this book, which is we need to inquire after other women's needs and be inquired after. Sometimes people will not share if they're not invited into the space to share. And again, we have such a culture of service. We pass down this culture from mother to daughter so often that we don't sometimes think about ourselves. And I think that that's one of the main takeaways too, right? Like that you are a human first above everything else, right? You're not a mother, you're not a teacher, a wife. You are first a person, and then those other things can be a part of your identity. But from the female culture perspective, I did appreciate in this book that she illuminates that we as women lose our identities in these labels. Whereas for men, it's not that common. You don't become a father and all of a sudden you're now not a person. Whereas for a mother, it does become that. So I think there's some good takeaways. And I think I appreciate your story, Mom, and what you highlighted on it was, you came from a loving home. All was fabulous, but you came from a culture of service and selflessness that you didn't know your needs. And if you don't know your needs and you aren't asked about your needs, how can you live your life where you're fully engaged?
So one thing that was interesting, and maybe this is me jumping ahead, but this is something that I've actually been grappling with really recently. And Ashlyn, you and I have talked about this a little bit, is this balance, the forever favorite word that is so hard to achieve, of starting to prioritize your needs, but not going so far into this place of selfishness. Because I think, yes, there's some gender a little bit, but I also think that this is also just part of the human experience. And maybe it's something that as a woman, I concern myself with more. Is, for example, even the story that I was telling to you all before we started, which I'm not going to repeat here, but it was essentially a story about a conflict where someone in my life had one opinion and all I wanted to do was solve the conflict, but then I also didn't want to reject my own feelings. And I think there's this struggle of I have gotten so much better over the last even decade of my life, and I'm only in my 20s, of speaking my feelings, knowing those are valid. And again, I grew up in a household where my mom is a social worker, so all of my feelings were very valid and always listened to and accepted, and from my dad too. But at what point there's a receiving end on that? So at what point do you can't just only consider your own feelings in every situation and ignore that other point of view, because there really is a fine line where you do become a selfish human being and you're not considering other people and you're not considering the people that you care about. So I don't think it's enough to just say like, your feelings always matter, you're always valid, always express what you feel, your anger is okay. Because I have personally slipped into that where you get almost defiant at this point where you're like, I've spent so much time explaining myself, I'm just not going to explain myself to anyone, and I don't owe anyone anything. And it's like, Well, sometimes you do, and you care about these other people in your life. So how do you balance your own feelings with those other people's? And I think again, that is maybe something that I think other people can relate to, but I think that's one of my life's struggles, is that ebb and flow of nurturing your own feelings and needs, but not letting it move to this place of selfishness. And I don't know the answer for that, but I do think it's something that's important to bring up, because my fear when we go so far into anger, like I think the tone of this book is that we get so defiant and it's like, well, my needs matter. And then it's like, well, but my needs don't matter more than yours, and yours don't matter more than mine. But where do we find this balance?
Ashley and I were actually just having this conversation today. It was really interesting. And I'll let Ashlyn jump in here in just one second. But I think you need to look to Love's 6 actions, especially the 6th action, which is respect. We have to respect that everybody has needs. And like you say, it's just the balance. It really is the balance. And it's understanding. This is where Ashlyn and I, we've studied these Reiki and personality patterns like really, really in depth. And so those personality patterns have needs associated with them, essentially. And so you're honoring what the other person needs, but still being able to honor your needs when you really understand how each of you are interacting with conflict. And that probably didn't mean a thing to those listening if you don't know about the Reiki and personality patterns.
But Paige, really quick, just to interject, it's funny because when you said, would you recommend this or not? I actually, honest to God, the first thought that came to my head is I would recommend reading Your Love Ignites Peace, A Next Evolution over this in terms of women empowerment. And I know that that wasn't necessarily your end goal to be, a book about women empowerment. It was just your story. But I thought that it happened to be very empowering for women and gave you tools to deal with conflict and to navigate it with the tone of love.
Oh, thank you, Jenna.
Yeah, this book, we were just talking about that today also. It's layer 1 of like understand. But now you got to go in there and you got to apply the rest of Udafar. You got to discern, accept, forgive, allow, accept, forgive, respect. Like you've got to do for those listening, Udafar, understand, discern, allow, forgive, accept, respect is my go-to acronym for Love 6 actions. You follow them and you will go far. I'm digressing, but I felt like I needed to put that out there for those that don't know. But yeah, this is just layer 1. And then you've got to put the rest of those into motion to really integrate, I think, in a healthy way, some of these discoveries. And this is just one of my hot takes. Like, I have kind of a love-hate with our therapy culture. I think therapy can be such a beautiful thing and so healthy for people, especially people that need to talk about things. But I also do see like a toxic side of things where people are getting so emboldened with these, like what you said, Jenna, of like my needs. I mean, I've shared this before, right? I have a cousin that came home from therapy at like 15 and was like, well, my therapist told me that my needs are the only needs that matter. And I was like, your needs do matter and you're a people pleaser, but guess what? That's not real life. Like other people matter too. And it had created quite a snowball effect in her life of what one might deem as selfishness. And again, there's so many nuances, but I think we have to be careful because she's a psychotherapist, this author, and the course that the certification we're currently doing, we're with social workers, therapists, counselors, and a woman made a comment today on our coaching call about how, if you're not actively fighting for me, then you're not with me. So you might be like a good dad, but if you're not then now going out there and, standing up to any man that's not fully in support, you're not on my team. And I'm like, whoa, things have gotten out of hand in my personal opinion, which is what we're talking about. I know this is a hot take. Some of you listening may agree. Some of you may disagree. And I respect that. And that's why this is, again, a book club and we get to opine. And I love that you have your opinions too. But I do think we get in dangerous waters with the tone of a book like this, where you can get a little bit askew. Now, my last comment on this is the pendulum. I think sometimes when we create change, we have to kind of pendulum further. Jenna, you and I have talked about this. Like, if you've never spoken your truth, which is not about Jenna, we've just talked about the pendulum. If you've never spoken your truth, then you might go a little AWOL. You might swing to the opposite side all of a sudden and just be like a wild banshee. And then as you develop the healthy skills, you find your equilibrium in the middle. And I think that that's one answer to your question, Jenna, of like, okay, I recognize I have needs. I'm starting to figure out how to exert those. And then now that I actually embody that and am healthy, I can bring a balanced approach to the world of my needs with others. And then to tie it with a bow with my mom's point, you can honor each other's needs better by understanding each other more deeply. For example, through the 5 personality patterns that we're coming out with a course with in January. Like all this cool stuff. I will stop talking now and see.
We should probably move on to the second question. And we got into it a little bit deeper there with that one, just beyond what did we think of the book. I think it's what did we think of the concepts within the book is what we really dove into in that. So the next question is, for our male listeners, what would you say to them about this book?
I would say, so this might transcend beyond what the book is, but I was thinking about just that. I'm like, what do men think of this? And I think this is not even about the book. It's just empowering the women in your life. And I would say recognize the superpowers that women have. I think a lot of times women in society potentially get written off for like emotions or are you on your period or whatever. But the saying about like a rising tide rises all boats, I botched that, but you guys know what I'm talking about. Stronger females make a better society overall, and only weak men see that as threatening. Only insecure men see that as threatening. So again, I feel lucky enough to have a partner that I feel like is a shoulder to cry on, like allows me to have my emotions, allows me to speak my opinion for the 8,000th time when honestly he's probably sick of hearing it. And he also emboldens me. One of the best things he's taught me is how to negotiate my salary. If you asked me like 6 years ago, I'd be like, I couldn't dare ask for more money. And he's like, this is what you deserve. And this is what you are worth. And you need to see that. And you shouldn't have to explain that to other people, but you're going to get out there and do this. And I think that has honestly changed my life, teaching me so many of these skills. So I think like empower the women that you're around, like listen to them, uplift them. And if you're scared to do that, you need to look within to see what the insecurities within you are. And if a female is threatening your value as a human being, there's probably some deeper work to do there.
Yeah.
Teresa, do you have any thoughts on this one?
You know what? I think this book, you could go down about 82 rabbit holes. I do. And it a little bit, it had a tone of almost pitting men against women. There was an undertone of that. And not all men are hard of hearing, so to speak. Not all men are insensitive. And sometimes through the book, I felt there was broad brush strokes. Again, I think her book was so personally written that her scream was louder than what she was trying to say. It just was almost deafening through the book for me. So as far as going down rabbit holes with it, there's the mother-daughter, there's grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, they're multi-generational. So there's women pitted, women against women can do the same thing. I almost want to retitle or do a different book instead of the silent female scream. How about loud, big ears for listening? It's if everybody's screaming, who's listening? Are you listening with your heart? Are you listening with your eyes and observing? Are you listening with your thoughts? There's just so much discontent. And if I yell louder about my cause, maybe you'll hear me, whether it's within a marriage or being a mother, a grandmother, whatever. sometimes we can be quiet and get a lot more done. What's that saying with President Roosevelt? Walk softly and carry a big stick. I would say that is my daughter. She is so powerful and so strong and in great positions to empower women, but she also empowers men. And she doesn't do it with force or screaming or bitching and complaining. She just walks the talk. And sometimes I think we need to do that.
I want to add something that you just said when you talked about listening, to go back to the question around, what would we say to the male listeners? I would say the biggest takeaway is to inquire and then listen. Ask your partner, ask your person, ask the women in your life, what do you need? How often, and this again is for them to reflect on, living in a society that does typically prioritize a male's needs as a general brushstroke statement, how often are you then listening and inquiring? And I think our generation, to Jenna's point, is doing so much better. I think guys like Martin and many other men in our generation are being that equal partner. I don't see Jenna and Martin having kids and Martin being like, oh, I'm going to babysit tonight. Like, he's not that kind of guy. Like, he's going to be an equal partner in his paternal role as their father, but that's the way it used to be. Like, I think that you ladies definitely can see that. So I think the biggest thing is listening, inquire, ask, hold some space for the women to share their voices.
The first part of this book was written, I think you felt like there was a lot of blame to patriarchy. And I actually think there's a lot of literature out there that does put that blame on patriarchy. And I don't think there's any doubt that we live or have lived in a patriarchal society that puts men's needs first. And in a society that has made women's needs invisible and have made women at times invisible and not heard and not seen, which I think is kind of the crux of this female scream is, I have a voice. I am not invisible. I am a human being. But one thing that, she did wrap it up at the end of this book, and I think this is an important piece to the patriarchy out there. Basically, at the end of the book, she was saying, I don't blame patriarchy. This is just to create an awareness. And what we need to realize is that our sons, our husbands, our fathers are just as damaged by patriarchy as we women have been. I mean, how awful to be. I mean, men aren't really allowed. I mean, they can have their emotional needs. But if they start becoming emotional, then that's a bad thing. Like, boys don't cry, men, there's whole sets of patriarchy around boys that are very unhealthy for them as well to be whole human beings. And I do think she recognized that at the end of the book. The other thing I want to say is I love that none of you guys are like blaming patriarchy. Because I think that's such an easy thing to slip into. We've been victimized. The solution to this is not to carry our victim flag, but our solution is to go out there and be seen, be heard, be loving, be kind, express our desires. Don't allow our needs to continually take a back seat. And as Teresa said, and I think it's an excellent point, is that oftentimes we women have perpetuated this silencing within our own female community.
Mm-hmm. It happens a lot all around us. So many examples. And sometimes I scratch my head. And so I'm really honored to, I look at entrepreneurs here in front of us and marketing and at different ages, and we are showing up. Everything is important. I may just own a little boutique in Castle Rock, but I'm a woman who owns a boutique and has a business, and am I, swimming and treading water in social media and computer things? But we're showing up. Paige is, developing and becoming an author and a speaker. And Ashlyn, you're co-founding. We're showing up. We can be a beacon. And I am really proud to say there are many women that I daily am in a circle of. So part of what I want to say, maybe I have a privilege, but who do we associate with is a big deal. Who are the people in your circle? If they're toxic, whether it be a friend or a family or a coworker, and they're shutting you down, that's our choice to keep being in that arena with them. Just because we're related doesn't mean we have to still have that conversation, or a coworker or whatever. Who do you associate with will define you.
There's so many ties into the book about what both you, Teresa, and my mom just said. To your last point, she talks about that with the idea of the mirror. Like, the people around you are a mirror to what you believe and hold in yourself. So if you believe your needs are valid and worthy of being respected, you put yourself in situations with people like that. You no longer can stay with those that don't honor that, which then actually ties into something else that my mom was saying about men and their struggles. And in the book, Rosjke writes, you cannot give what you do not own yourself. So if you want to talk about patriarchy not showing up for the needs of women, we then also need to look at how are we not showing up for the needs of men. You know, we've got I think an epidemic of men in their middle-aged point of life. This is why you call it a midlife crisis, that have given their entire life to doing what's expected of them, getting married, getting the house, providing for their family, and they've completely lost sense of self along the way. They don't know who they are. Their needs haven't been acknowledged. So again, we have this whole cycle, and I did want to read a quote that was on page 177, and it said, "We have to challenge the culture's message. This means that we have to become educated to the messages that mold our sons and ourselves. We have to start seeing our boys as victims, just like females are, of gender molding. Boys are victims of a patriarchal system that needs unemotional men to fight, win battles, and make huge amounts of money without recognizing the people they kill, walk over, or damage." Which I'm going to ad lib, that's the end of the quote, but I would say including themselves. So a lot of layers to this.
Yeah, this was, I've done a lot of work on myself over the last 20 years, like really peeling back the layers and self-awareness. But there was a level of this book to me that opened up another layer of awareness that I feel like maybe I hadn't fully brought to my consciousness yet.
I definitely think this book made me think of you sometimes, Mom, because I think that you have had a culture of being silenced and silencing yourself. 10-second side note, to Teresa's point about women doing this to each other, I highly recommend reading The Mother-Daughter Puzzle, because she really dives into why we continue perpetuating this from woman to woman. It's almost a fight for our needs to be seen. It's the one spot we can be heard. It's really fascinating how she does it and shares it in that The Mother-Daughter Puzzle book. Honestly, would really recommend that book. Probably won't be recommending this one. But
I was just thinking, I don't know, I don't think we've touched on this yet, but I think, and this wasn't so much of what the book is about. And also, spoiler, I didn't finish this one because I couldn't. I picked it up, I would read 3 pages and I would get really irritated and I would put it down. And then I'd do the same thing. And then I'd get into a groove where I was like, oh, this is getting better. And then I would get really irritated because it just felt like a buzzkill for me. Regardless, we haven't really talked about the ways in which I guess the patriarchal society kind of works against women. And again, I want to keep the conversation light and positive, but there are some really interesting things. Like, for example, last week I was talking to my coworker who has 4 children, and she's been at the company that I'm at through all of those pregnancies. And I was asking her out of curiosity because I will be married in a year and we would like to start a family within some time after that, not wait too long. And I was asking her about what the pregnancy leave looked like, and she's like, oh, we don't get one. And I was like, what? And then she's like, yeah, we only get it through the government. And she was like, I was like, and you had 4 children under this process? Like, why are you still here? And then she was like, well, I was so young when I had my first yada yada. And I was so shocked. And I worked for a women-owned, founded, and operated company. And that is part of the company culture. And so it's really interesting because, again, it led me to believe I don't feel like I just felt shocked. I don't necessarily feel like victimized by that, but I was just thought, I was like, in what ways are these just like, we're talking about like interpersonal relationships for much of the conversation. And it's like, wow, like in what ways has that just become so part of society that like a women founded and owned business is just like, oh yeah, we don't have to pay for that. And it was really, really interesting. So I don't know where I was going with that point, but it's just something that I think we haven't talked about, that I think some of that is our voices need to be heard. Well, if no woman who has yet to come in this company has ever, quote unquote, complained about this, well, they are being silenced in a way. And it's like, what? Nobody has, I guess, started that conversation. And it would be interesting. It's like, maybe I'll be the one to start that conversation and say, like, look, what's going on here? Like, women deserve the right to have some time with their children and not have to be so worried about their finances in the process. But I think, again, some of these things we are led to just like accept as like, oh, it is what it is. And then you think like, wait a minute, this isn't right. So I do think we need to be like empowered in those senses. And I think she was using anger as a tool to do that, because she's like, we've gotten so far to this place of acceptance that we're like kind of like just aloof in everything that's going on. And I think it is important to use our voices, but I would just argue that igniting that flame out of anger isn't necessarily going to also lead to like the most productive conversations and changes.
Your story almost makes me think, here's the rabbit hole. You have a women-owned company, right? I just want to make sure I did hear that correctly. Yep. It's almost like there's no medical leave. We're going to be exactly like a man. So we're going to show you. We don't need that. We don't have to do this. We can be just like a man. That's what that culture, when you were describing it, sounds like to me. Why would that upper culture feel the need to have to compare themselves and stand shoulder to shoulder as a company and not make a change? We'll be like a man. Why not be like a woman?
Yeah, and then to our own detriment. Like, okay, we're just gonna shoot ourselves in the foot to say like,
yeah,
stick it to it. And I mean, this could open up into a whole other conversation, because it's like a cost saving. So in what ways can like a female-owned company just go off the back of like, oh, well, all the male companies before us have done this, so we can just do the same thing and save a cost? But it is just really interesting, and that is a conversation that came to mind that I thought was worth.
I mean, they could be the women-owned company. Why aren't they hiring all men? Then you don't have to give. Do you know what I mean? I mean, the concept is just doesn't work.
And again, it's up to us if we want to change it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Be a female-owned company and do something different. Or what you said, Jenna, I love, you go speak your voice. Like that, roar that female scream, but don't do it in a disrespectful way. Do it in a way that I know you absolutely will. And that'll create change. It starts with us.
Yeah. I'm just going to say one sentence because we need to move on to the next question. But motherhood is a very devalued business industry. The industry of motherhood is,
I think it's taken
really not looked upon with a lot of respect.
Yeah, it's taken for granted what a woman does.
Let's move on to the next question. On page 35, on one side we have girl power, which encourages girls to think big, want big, and to be able to do anything. Yet while we are dreaming big, we should also follow the code and be chaste, quiet, thin, and giving, denying the desire for sexual pleasure, food, and self-interest. What are your thoughts on this?
We could go down another deep rabbit hole on this one as well. Personally, I see a lot of women perpetuating that hole. I do. Through all the decades of my life, I think women contribute to that as a lot, equally as we think the male contributes to that way of thinking of women.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because they don't think it's not that they don't think they have any value, but they think in order to be enough, to be seen, to be loved, they have to meet a certain standard. And honestly, I am sick and tired of this standard, personally. I am so into girl power. Yes, we have desires, we have dreams, we're human beings, but I certainly don't need to look a certain way, nor do I need to deny, whatever, my love of food or whatever it is to be, to be out there in the world being a successful woman. I don't want you to frown on me for what I'm eating or how I look. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous.
I agree with you completely. I mean, I don't have anything to add to that necessarily. It is interesting, Teresa, because I agree with you. I think sometimes some of this shutting down does come from other women in the sense that it's like, dream big, but not so big that you're threatening me and my identity. Like, I think you see that from a lot of women in the way women talk about other women. And we've talked about motherhood being devalued, which it is to gigantic extent, but it's interesting because this is going down another rabbit hole, but one of the primary industries that has come out of moms is mom influencing, because people want a piece of the pie and women want to continue to make their own money while being a present parent. And not that you can't be a present parent with a corporate job, it's just that type of career offers the flexibility of being at home with your children. And then we also rag on these women that are doing that. Like, who does she think she is? Like, posting all these pictures of herself, and then it's just like, it's never ending and we kind of can't win. But I kind of do see, at least with the people in my life, and I've been very intentional with the people I surround myself with, I don't get a lot of that. Like, the only men in my life are people who say, yes, dream big, continue to dream big, you can do whatever you want. How can I be of support to you, not because I'm a man, but because I am a loving person in your life? And like, that is who I am surrounded by. So I think that, again, it goes back to trying to surround yourself with more of those people. Get the people out of your life that are trying to diminish your dreams and saying one thing but doing another. And I know it's easier said than done, because there is privilege that comes with that, with being able to decipher who you want in your life and don't. But I do think a lot of it starts with that. And that's not to, again, dismiss the experience of anyone who's been through some of these awful things that we only lightly touched on, abuse being the primary one. I don't want to sound dismissive of that experience at all. I just can't speak on that because it's not my story. But yeah, I did just want to say that disclaimer.
All I can just continually say is we need to read the mother-daughter puzzle, because everything you just said about, again, the women not encouraging other women, there's a reason there is that conflict. There is a need that's not being met. There is something that's being silenced. There's a jealousy. This can happen in the mother-daughter relationship. Like, that a mother can be incredibly jealous of her daughter because the mother has all these unfulfilled dreams that this daughter has then been able to go and pursue. So it's just, there's this whole dynamic that is then created within our matriarchal side of society that we really have to look into. And I don't have a ton to add, but my thing I was going to say about the quote on girl power is I've absolutely felt the dichotomy of these expectations of 1,000 quadrillion %. Like, you're supposed to be everything to everyone while also like being small, while also still being a woman, while still fitting in the box. So I think that it is, this was depicted in Barbie, the movie Barbie. America Ferrera has a whole huge monologue where she goes on about it. And like, in fact,
I was just thinking of the same thing, and I was like, I've been talking too long, I'm not going to bring that up, but I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, she literally says, "It is literally impossible to be a woman. You are so beautiful and so smart. It kills me that you don't think you're good enough." Like, we always have to be extraordinary, but somehow we're always doing it wrong. You have to be thin, but not too thin. And you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but you also have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time. You have to be a career woman, but also be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much that you threaten other women because you're supposed to be a part of the sisterhood. But always stand out and always be grateful, but never forget that the system is rigged. So find a way to acknowledge that, but also always be grateful. You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard. It's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. And it turns out, in fact, that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault. I am just so tired of watching myself and every single other woman tie herself into knots so that people will like us. And if all of that is also true for a doll just representing women, then I don't even know. So, again, I think this is a sentiment that we do experience often, but you also then have, I think as a woman, this is where you then have to find yourself and find your identity and your truths.
I think that was our mic drop moment tonight, Ashlyn. Great job.
Thank you. It's me, Barbie.
All right, well, let's wrap this up. So, did you guys have any takeaways from this book? The question was, what were your top 3 takeaways from this book? But did you have any takeaways?
Well, I didn't have 3, I'm sorry, but I did have one, and it was the questionnaire on page 192. And I did look at that, and I answered him, and I worked through them, and I thought, for me, I thought that was the best part of the book. So I'm sorry, I didn't have 3 takeaways.
One of my takeaways, I didn't have 3 either, but I was just looking through the things that I highlighted, and towards the first half of the book, there was something about just our antenna and tuning in to our needs. And I thought that was a really good analogy of like always tuning back to your antenna and like what frequency is your antenna tuned into. Oftentimes it's tuned away from ourselves and it's on like somebody else's channel and we're not tuned in to listening to what we feel. I think that was a good takeaway. And coming full circle to something you mentioned earlier, Paige, I really do think, and maybe part of the reason that this was like book turned me off is I think that this is the step 1. And so I think this would maybe be a good resource for a woman who hasn't ever, just nothing in her head has clicked that she has value and has a voice. And I think that this could be empowering, but I think that the antenna of turning back to ourselves and listening to our needs is always a good reminder.
And to give grace to the woman that hasn't ever had that, I think it's just, again, it's the programming that she's experienced and the belief she's adopted. Like, I want to give compassion to those women that haven't acknowledged their voices, because the reality is that perhaps you just were never like shown that that's a possibility. No one ever illuminated that evidence for you, or culturally it went against everything in your family. There's a chance of rejection. Like, there are a lot of reasons that women don't speak up and have abandoned themselves. And I do think this book gave some good points of compassion for that. But now that you know better, do better.
Yeah, and Ashlyn, I think we'd be remiss not to even mention there are countries and cultures in the world that don't value women whatsoever. So we're speaking from a very US, Western perspective, and I think that there is privilege that comes with that, of course. So I think that there has been, I don't know, I don't want to lack sensitivity to that. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. You both bring up an excellent point. An excellent point.
I totally agree. And I'm just going to go into my takeaways because I think it just snowballs into this again from our Western culture perspective. My first one I had written down was, I am only as invisible as I allow myself to be. So allow this to be your call to action, right? Like, you have your voice, you get to decide to use it or not. The next one was, silence will not help any of us create relationships in which we are heard, loved, seen, and nurtured. So again, use that voice. Silence is not helping you. 3, I actually do think anger has a spot here. And obviously we need to learn how to be healthy with that anger. I did a mother-daughter map with somebody the other day who was sharing that her mom actually had so much anger it made her afraid of anger, like that she didn't want to share it. So, we do have to find a healthy way to express that anger. But I think it's very fair that anger, unexpressed, repressed anger, can manifest in your body as different health issues or as different mental health crises of depression or anxiety, because you're not expressing this overwhelming emotion that does need to flow through you. It should not and cannot get stuck. And then I'm just going to add 2 more. I am going to say it's normal to need to be mothered, because I think that sometimes we also take on this like feeling as women that we shouldn't need anything from anyone. And I think it's okay to need your mom. I think it's okay to need support. So that's another takeaway. And then lastly, I already said this one, but you are a woman first.
I am apparently not near as evolved as all of you other women on this book club podcast, because I obviously needed my eyes open to the fact that I had not been expressing my needs. So that was a kind of that was an awakening to me, that I hadn't been expressing my emotional needs because I really didn't have any. I had buried those needs so deeply. And part of those needs were buried in what was my second takeaway, was this idea that she talks about this culture of female service. And I mean, I really bought into that. That's, I was raised in Southern Iowa, and I mean, we women, we did it all. Not that my dad didn't help. He did. He was a wonderful helper with all of those things. But then in my marriage, my husband was very much raised in a very patriarchal society that said, the woman's in the kitchen, the woman cleans the house, the woman, and you go to work every day. So I even told the story just earlier today. We had what appeared to be a very evolved kind of situation. When the kids were little, he stayed home with the kids and I went to work. But the piece of that was missing was he never did a load of laundry. He never picked up the house. He didn't make dinner. So when I came home from work, all of those things were still waiting. So this idea of culture of female service was like a really big, like, oh my gosh. Yes. And now, after reading this book, honest to God, I was telling Ashlyn, when I am in my next relationship, we're going to have a discussion on this, because I mean, I am not your slave, because I am a woman. So I am obviously not near as evolved as you guys, because I had some very high level takeaways from this book. And then really the last thing was it's not so, we all need to ask each other. And I think we need to bring this language to all of our relationships, which the language is, what do you need? What are your dreams? What are your desires? And the other piece of that for me is, this point, I don't need you to ask me that question. What I need now is to be empowered enough to be able to speak that on my own. And that I haven't necessarily been in that place.
Paige, you saying that you're not as evolved is, 1, so incorrect. And 2, such a women qualifying statement of
you're right, Jenna.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Or Teresa, you also said something earlier, which I catch myself doing this all the time, but I think it's good that we call out the people we love and care about. You said, I just own a small business in Castle Rock, Colorado. No, you don't you own a damn business in Castle Rock, Colorado, and that's incredible.
I agree with you. I worded it like that in making my point that women just. So to clarify that is, there was a reason why I used those words and making that point.
Excuse me, Teresa, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
A part of the reason we women aren't taken as seriously as men sometimes is because of all that language we use to soften what we have to say instead of just saying it.
I do that on book club all the time because I get nervous when I don't like a book, that I don't want to have that. Maybe this ties a nice bow on all of the anger we're talking about. Maybe sometimes there's a fear of like having this anger and being like the angry, mad woman, which in my personal relationships, I don't have trouble expressing anger. But I think sometimes you don't want to be seen as that like angry woman who like has a negative opinion about something. Like you have to always look at the positive angle or experience. And if I look back on every single book club where I have not enjoyed the book, I always have added qualifiers. I would put money on the fact that I've done that because I don't want to offend anyone else who loved the book. I don't want to offend the listeners. I don't want to offend the author if God forbid they ever listen to it. And so it is interesting. Like every time I have something that's like maybe a negative or not the most glowing review, I'm always like, well, I think this way because XYZ, and you might not agree, but this is my experience, and I totally qualify it. And I do that with other things in my life too. So good awareness.
Well, to just put a bow around that too, it's like, hello, ladies, this is the book we just read. Why do we do the things that we do? I mean, I know we're talking about the silencing of it, but there are different ways we silence ourselves. For example, qualifiers. Hi, I'm just reaching out. How often does a guy email, I'm just reaching out to check and see if you have those materials? He's like, yo, bitch. No, I'm just kidding. He's like, hello.
Do you have those materials?
Do you have the
Question mark.
materials? Literally
Yeah.
said, and we're like,
Yeah.
hello. And, well,
Look how we're evolving right here on this book club discussion. We're all evolving. And I didn't mean to say that I wasn't evolved. I just meant in this whole idea with this book around, and I told you this was another layer for me. I really hadn't unpacked this layer of really how I was being a woman in this patriarchal society. And that really was somewhat eye-opening to me.
Well, I love it. Well, let's go ahead and rate the book. What do you think?
This one's going to be a 2 for me because I didn't enjoy the experience of reading the book, but I had a great discussion and I wanted to come out that page. I actually think over the last, we've been doing this book club for 2 years. I think you had the best takes that maybe you've ever had. Your takeaways and your shares with the audience were really good. So I loved that part of the book club.
Well, thank you, Jenna.
I'm going to give it a 2-.
Is that a 1.75?
Anybody that can write a book, they get at least a 1+. For God's sakes, come on. There's some credit to that, and her education and her viewpoints. By no means I take away from that. I think there's great honor and respect, whether it's a man, woman, or child that has the education, and to even get something in print, I think is fabulous. For me personally, it just didn't resonate on a lot of levels, and I thought my 2- was it was an angry book, and it just didn't resonate for me personally.
What about you, Mama?
Well, I'm actually going to give it a 3.5 because you guys can tell from this discussion, I actually did have some takeaways from it. And though there was an angry overtone, I will agree in the beginning, I did think she put a bow around that, as Ashlyn likes to say, a little bit at the end with her chapter on mothers and sons and not blaming the patriarchy, and that our sons are suffering as much as we women, we daughters and mothers have suffered.
I didn't get that far, so I can't even give it a full ranking.
That's hilarious. Well, I'm going to give it a 2.5. I'm going to say this for the 77th time on this podcast. Read the mother-daughter puzzle. Even if it's not about your mother-daughter relationship, the takeaways are so, so, so salient. They are so solid. Like that book, I would give a 5 or at least a 4. So go ahead and read her second book. I think she does a great job at that. But this one, it's going to be a 2.5 for me. Not going to be a winner. So
I have to be really honest. I have no desire to read another book she wrote. It would be
I know
very difficult for me to do that.
That's why I keep reinforcing, like, it's so different. Like, reading that book, my mind was popping off. There were so many pieces that were going together. Paige and I had deeper understanding of each other. This book was just kind of like, I struggled reading it myself. I couldn't get into it. I wasn't getting a lot of takeaways. It was kind of this just swipe through moment. I totally get it, Teresa. I honor that. I totally get it. But that's why I have said it about now 78 times. Because I'm like, I swear it's better.
Okay.
Well, there is, believe it or not, listeners, there is some method to the madness here. And last month we read the 5 love languages, and then this month the female scream. And if you can see kind of the theme in all of this, it really is about how to honor each other's needs, honor our own needs emotionally. And that is a subject that I don't really think is talked about that much in our culture. And I think it's a really important topic that we start having these discussions with each other and we start putting a language to that. For next month, we have something different and super fun, and it is kind of going along with our theme, but we're actually going to read a fiction book, and it's called The Red Tent. It is an oldie but a goodie. Teresa and I both read this book many years ago. I'm rereading it again now. I actually started reading it to Ashlyn when she was just beginning her womanhood, but we never finished it. And it is a lovely, lovely story. And I'm excited to gather with you women and to gather with our online community and really come together in a way where we can be heard and seen by each other as women. The book again is The Red Tent by Anita Diamant.
Well, with that said, let's read our parting quote here, which is from chapter 10. And it's simple, short, sweet, and to the point. It is, being truly heard without having to scream is every woman's greatest longing. So ladies, let's go into this week, and gentlemen, this next month, listening to each other, inquiring, and holding space for each other's needs.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We will be back next month with another book club podcast, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you. And as always, I'm sending you love from my heart to yours.
Get your freak on.